The concept of a dedicated ship for the transport and treatment of the sick and injured had come and gone over the course of history. They were certainly very useful in times of war, if for no other reason than to isolate potential outbreaks of disease from the rest of a fleet or operation. But the relatively basic nature of medical facilities throughout most of recorded history, combined with the expense of maintaining a ship that in peacetime had pretty little use, meant that hospital ships tended to be converted from other ships for a specific war, and then returned to their regular use afterwards. Such was the case at the outbreak of World War I, with not even the Royal Navy having active serving hospital ships on permanent duty at the start of the war. However, the rapidly rising casualties on all sides quickly brought the need for such vessels into focus. But who exactly needed them varied quite considerably. Now, although such vessels could be much safer and better equipped than your average frontline field hospital in most environments, the sheer number of casualties that the war was generating, combined with the availability of still larger and even better equipped medical facilities further behind the lines, meant that for the most part hospital ships served to treat and stabilise injured men while transporting them to these larger rear echelon or home-based facilities, rather than acting as floating frontline field hospitals cycling men back and forth to the front lines. But where these larger facilities actually were relative to the front lines was the primary factor in dictating the need for hospital ships, and therefore the number of vessels that would be converted to the role. For the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, almost all the fighting was being done with direct land lines back to their homeland. Likewise for the French and the Russians. Thus, the numbers of hospital ships serving with these nations was relatively small, but some did exist in each case. For the British and Imperial forces, however, whether the fighting was on the Western Front, Gallipoli, or one of the many colonial wars, in no case was there a land route back home. And in the case of Gallipoli, even the rear echelon hospitals were on islands some distance away from the landing zones overseas. Thus, it would be the Royal Navy and its associated Imperial Navies and naval services that would convert and commission the vast majority of hospital ships during World War I. Under the then recent latest ratifications of the Hague Convention, a hospital ship was theoretically immune to attack, providing it followed the following rules. It had to be clearly marked and lit as a hospital ship. It would have to give medical assistance to any wounded personnel, including those of enemy nations if they happened to be picked up. The ship couldn't be used for any military purpose. It wasn't allowed to interfere or hamper with enemy combatants, such as sailing a hospital ship between two enemy vessels that were fighting you. Various belligerents, as designated in the Hague Convention, i.e. people on opposite side, could search hospital ships to look into whether any of these restrictions were being violated. Everybody had to identify where their hospital ships were as best as they could. And in terms of markings, the hospital ship should have a white hull, which should therefore make it much easier to spot, and was specifically not to be in any kind of camouflage or colour pattern where it could be easily mistaken for a warship. And it was to have large red crosses painted on the hull, as well as long strips of colour. These could be red or green, depending on how people configured them. Hospital ships in the war would come in many shapes and sizes. Everything from small coastal steamers through royal yachts, passenger ferries, and even some of the biggest ocean liners of the time. They also came in three primary types. A full hospital ship was completely converted into a floating medical facility with doctors, nurses, a full suite of medical supplies, and various surgical equipment and operating theatres. A hospital carrier was a much quicker conversion, which had much more limited facilities, and as a shorthand you could easily think of them as relatively sterile ferry services with a little bit of medical provision. And then finally there were ambulance transports, which were just regular ships that had some space set aside for carrying the wounded. The first two, hospital ships and hospital carriers, had to follow the rules of the Hague Convention, but the ambulance ships, which could be carrying regular troops or other war-related cargo as well as wounded, could therefore be attacked as any other merchant vessel and couldn't carry those special markings. While most vessels would concentrate, as mentioned, on stabilizing and transporting the wounded to the nearest large land-based hospital facilities, there were some exceptions. The very largest ocean liners ended up with so much capacity in such extensive facilities that they were actually sometimes used as moored hospitals to expand on-site medical care, and other ships, such as the SS Maheno and Marama of New Zealand, were tasked specifically with bringing wounded but stabilized casualties all the way back home from the front lines for permanent care and or discharge from service. Now, although theoretically immune from attack, several dozen hospital ships would be damaged or sunk during the war. Some of them were from minefields, and of course, mines have no idea what flag or protection a ship that runs into them is flying. Some were torpedoed or otherwise attacked in error, or where an attacker believed the ship was secretly undertaking warlike activities with good evidence. And a few, particularly during the period in the latter stages of World War I where the Germans were practicing unrestricted submarine warfare, were deliberately attacked by U-boats. And of those, in a few cases, the U-boats then actually surfaced to finish off the survivors to cover up the attack because they knew exactly what they were doing. The case of HMHS Llandovery Castle, sunk by U-86, stood out as the worst incident, where the submarine repeatedly machine-gunned survivors in the water and repeatedly rammed lifeboats filled with wounded and nurses, despite clearly seeing who was on board. A single lifeboat escaped to relay the horror. Unfortunately, most of those responsible for these latter incidents managed to escape punishment. Although the Royal Navy had considered a purpose-built hospital ship in the mid-1900s, it seems that the first modern purpose-built hospital ship to be actually constructed would be USS Relief, which was laid down in 1917, but didn't commission until after the end of World War I. She would, however, go on to perform valuable service in World War II, setting a trend for purpose-built and maintained medical ships, although conversions in times of need would also continue.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.